Let me begin by something both you and David Brooks write about, and they're the words of another columnist, Simon Johnson. He has a piece in Atlantic Monthly called The Quiet Coup. What is the essence of what he's writing about?
Well, I think it's actually quite frightening, and if I had one article that I could recommend this month that every American would read, it would be Simon Johnson's, because he was previously the chief economist with the International Monetary Fund and has dealt with very severe financial crises in all sorts of countries, similar to the one with which the United States and the rest of the world is currently dealing. And what he says is that the way in which the crisis has unfolded in the United States, and I think more importantly, the way in which we're attempting to address that crisis, is very similar to the way in which other emerging market nations who have experienced grave financial collapse, and he lists Argentina and Russia as the prime examples, attempted to deal with their financial crisis. And in particular, what he says is that what those societies were characterized by, more than anything else, was domination by a very narrow financial elite, essentially the oligarchical class within the country, which was able to influence and control the government to enact policies that were designed to benefit only that narrow class. And because they were so unrestrained in what they were able to do, because their control over their government was so virtually unlimited, they were able to run amok and create essentially financial catastrophe. And then once that catastrophe was created, what the government would then seek to do, because it was so influenced by the wealthiest individuals, is, as a response to the crisis, try and enact even further policies that was designed to prop up and benefit the very oligarchs who caused the crisis in the first place. And what Simon Johnson says is that what's happening in the United States is exactly that our Congress and our government are so controlled, essentially so owned by the financial elites who caused the crisis, that what we're doing is continuing to prop them up at the expense of ordinary Americans.
One point we should mention is that Simon Johnson is going to be with us on Monday for a full hour to take your phone calls from 8 to 9 Eastern Time. But in his piece, he says that essentially the finance industry has effectively captured our government.
Well, I mean, I don't think there's any doubt about that. A colleague of his, who was previously an economist at the IMF as well, the same day that Simon Johnson's article came out, had an op-ed in the Washington Post in which he essentially said that Goldman Sachs, the New York investment bank, seems to have a virtual lock on Treasury Department positions. Under the Clinton administration, the Treasury Secretary was the former Goldman CEO, Robert Rubin. Of course, under President Bush, the CEO who designed the bailout packages was former Goldman Sachs CEO Hank Paulson. The current Treasury Secretary, Tim Geithner, is a protege of Robert Rubin. His chief of staff is a former lobbyist with Goldman Sachs. And that's just one firm. But you look across the government, and what you see is the financial industry, through its enormous financial resources, pouring money into the campaign coffers of the members of Congress, controlling members of the executive branch. And so each and every policy that the executive branch under both Bush and Obama have promulgated and advocated as a response to the crisis has as the prime beneficiaries the financial elites who fund them and who control them, and to whom they are inextricably linked. And it's a form of extreme corruption in general. And I think in a case where there's a real crisis, it's a particular problem. The other thing I would underscore is that if you go back and look at how the crisis began, in the 1990s, the financial industry was advocating rigorously that many of the limitations that existed on what they were able to do, that were in place since the Great Depression to prevent another depression, were abolished one by one on a bipartisan basis, because they fund both political parties and they were able to write the laws, and those regulations were abolished at their behest. That's what caused the financial crisis, and that same corrupt system is still fueling what is intended to be the solution.
From the G20 to legalizing drugs to Gitmo, you're writing about it all, and we will get into some of the specifics. Do you also Twitter?
Actually, I've started to Twitter, and I think just to experiment with whether it has real value. I haven't actually seen the value in it yet, but I'm still searching with an open mind. I think actually there is a danger that if our communications become too truncated, and Twitter has a 140-character limit on each entry, the amount of our discourse, the level of our discourse can degrade even further still. I mean, we already have political discourse dominated by very short 10-minute or 5-minute segments in between commercial breaks, assuming the public has a very small attention span. I think Twitter is a step in the wrong direction, and so I do think it has a potential to degrade our discourse even further.
Well, we're going to try it this morning. We'll see how many tweets we get. But if you want to log on to twitter.com/washjournal, and you can, if you have an account, we'll include some of your comments as part of our discussion with Glenn Greenwald. You wrote about a question that Chuck Todd, NBC News White House correspondent, asked President Obama at last week's news conference on the issue of sacrifices when it comes to the economy. What were you referring to?
Well, I found Chuck Todd's question unbelievably revealing about how our media stars think. There was a question that arose when George Bush began commencing wars in the wake of 9/11, which was, well, if we're really at war, don't we need to sacrifice as Americans? In other words, how is it that we can go and send our military around the world to invade, destroy, and then attempt to rebuild Iraq and occupy Afghanistan and send billions of dollars to Israel and flood the Middle East with our influence? How can we do all of that, put this enormous pressure, economic pressure, and at the same time give ourselves huge tax cuts? How can we fund this imperialistic foreign policy and at the same time pay less taxes? Eventually the system will collapse, and don't Americans need to sacrifice if we're truly at war? That was the question posed to the Bush administration. So Chuck Todd stood up and asked that same question, though this time to President Obama in a completely different context, in the context of the economic crisis, which he equated to a war. And he said, don't Americans, why aren't you asking Americans to sacrifice? It was a bizarre question, because if you don't live as a millionaire media star in Washington, you know that across the country, the whole point of the financial crisis is that there's enormous sacrifices being made by ordinary Americans. They're losing their jobs, they're losing their homes, they're losing their retirement security, the ability to send their children to college. And so it was both an idiotic question and at the same time I thought a revealing one, because it was essentially assuming that Americans aren't suffering enough, and that the key to solving the financial crisis, the premise embedded in this question was, and Chuck Todd's question, was that it isn't the financial elites who need to sacrifice, but it's ordinary Americans. They need to give up Social Security benefits, Medicare, Medicaid, and that is really what the political class is now attempting to do. It's what Simon Johnson actually says was done in Russia and Argentina and these other emerging market nations, which is that the financial elites caused the crisis, and then the government turns to ordinary Americans to demand sacrifice, and I think that's what Chuck Todd was advocating.
Let me ask you to respond to what David Brooks writes this morning in the New York Times, Greed and Stupidity. He's going to be with us in the next hour. He says the U.S. economy got finance heavy and finance mad and finally collapsed, and when it did, the elites did what all elites do. They took care of their own.
No, I think actually that's entirely true. You know, again, if you look at the way in which our government functions, it is essentially a wholly owned subsidiary of our financial elites, and that isn't how it was supposed to be. Lobbyists come to Washington on behalf of the largest corporations, and they write the laws. And that doesn't change if there's Republicans controlling the Congress or the Democrats controlling the Congress. The two political parties are funded largely by the same corporate interests who control our system of government. Those are the corporate factions that engorge themselves greedily at the expense of America's financial health, and they're the ones who continue to drive how the response is formulated. And I think it's an extremely serious problem that goes beyond the financial crisis into the fundamental corruption of how the United States government has been functioning.
Two other points. First of all, on Guantanamo, a week ago you said one of the problems that this government is going to face, and I'm paraphrasing, is that when these detainees are released, they're free to talk about their treatment. Is that something that the U.S. government is worried about? Is that something that, based on what you wrote about, the British government was able to stop?
I don't think there's any question that the Bush administration was very worried about that, and the Obama administration, unfortunately, seems to be just as committed to keeping concealed what it is that we did to detainees. I mean, there's a debate in this country about whether or not what the Bush administration did constituted torture and war crimes. It clearly did. Whether or not we were right to do it. Well, if that's true, then we ought to welcome, both sides of that debate ought to welcome having American courts decide whether or not what the government did was actually illegal. And we ought to welcome a full and free airing of what it was that was truly done to these detainees. And yet the Obama administration has been taking steps to prevent courts from ruling on the legality of the Bush administration's counterterrorism policies. And during the Bush era, it was actually classified. The detainees were prevented from being heard from, and now that some of them are being released, they're describing the brutal torture to which they were subjected, that we've prosecuted other countries for doing as war criminals before. And the question will inevitably rise as these disclosures multiply, which is, how is it that the United States could have prosecuted and led the crusade against these very acts when done by other countries? But now that our own political leaders have authorized them and perpetrated them, why should they remain immune from consequences for having committed serious domestic crimes and the most serious war crimes?